What if I told you the deadliest war in modern history began not with one sudden explosion, but with years of fear, humiliation, ambition, and bad decisions stacking on top of each other? World War II eventually pulled dozens of countries into fighting across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the oceans, turning factories, farms, laboratories, and one gigantic struggle. It killed tens of millions of people, destroyed cities, displaced families, toppled empires, and changed borders on a scale that still shakes the world. Yet the war was not inevitable in the simple sense that everyone woke up wanting catastrophe. Actually, it grew from choices made after World War I, economic shocks, aggressive dictatorships, failed diplomacy, and governments repeatedly gambling that the next crisis could still be contained. To understand why the conflict became so enormous, we need to start before the shooting, when Europe was officially at peace but politically unstable. That is the strange thing about huge historical disasters. They often look obvious afterward, while each earlier step once looked temporary, manageable, or someone else's problem. World War I ended in 1918, but the peace settlement left deep resentment rather than a clean reset. Germany lost territory, faced military restrictions, and was required to accept major financial obligations under the Treaty of Versailles. While many Germans experienced the settlement as national humiliation, across Europe, millions of veterans returned to economies struggling with debt, damaged infrastructure, political violence, and fear of revolution. Now, the new League of Nations was supposed to discourage aggression through collective security, but it had limited power and depended on member states actually acting together. The United States stayed outside the League. Several governments were distracted by domestic problems, and the post-war map created new minorities and border disputes. During the 1920s, diplomacy and economic recovery made another continental war seem less likely, yet the system remained fragile underneath. Then the Great Depression struck after 1929, crushing trade, jobs, savings, and trust in established political parties. Economic pain did not automatically create dictatorship, but it made radical promises easier to sell, especially when leaders offered simple enemies and dramatic national revival. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party exploded that instability, promising to overturn Versailles, rebuild German power, and create a racially defined authoritarian state. After becoming chancellor in 1933, Hitler dismantled democratic restraints, rearmed Germany, and tested whether other countries would stop him. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had already embraced fascist dictatorship and imperial expansion, while Japan's military leadership pursued greater control in East Asia. Well, each aggressive move sought the same dangerous lesson when the international response remained limited. Taking risks could work. Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, absorbed Austria in 1938, and then demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Britain and France accepted the Munich Agreement in hopes that satisfying the demand would preserve peace, a policy later associated with appeasement. The logic was not simply calidus. Leaders remembered the slaughter of World War I, fueled another conflict, faced military weaknesses, and hoped grievances could be settled without catastrophe. But Hitler interpreted concessions as evidence that opponents lacked the will to resist, and in March 1939, German forces occupied the rest of the Czech lands. By 1939, the next target was Poland, and the diplomatic situation became even more shocking when Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact in August. Secret arrangements divided parts of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, giving Hitler confidence that a German attack on Poland would not immediately create a two-front war. On September 1st, German forces invaded Poland using coordinated aircraft, armor, infantry, and communications to create rapid breakthroughs. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later, transforming another regional crisis into a European war. Actually, the popular word blitzkrieg can make the campaign sound like one magical tactic, but the deeper advantage came from operational concentration, speed, radio coordination, air support, and exploding enemy confusion. Soviet forces entered eastern Poland later in September under the terms of their arrangement with Germany. Poland was defeated within weeks, though Polish forces and government structures continued resistance from abroad. The fall of Poland showed how modern communications and mechanized forces could collapse a front faster than many planners expected. It also ended the illusion that Hitler's territorial demands could be satisfied one agreement at a time. After Poland, Western Europe entered a strange pause sometimes called the Phony War, with Britain and France technically fighting Germany, but without a major land offensive in the West. That pause ended dramatically in spring 1940 when Germany attacked Denmark and Norway, then turned against the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Allied planners expected the main German thrust through Belgium, but powerful German formations drove through the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse, cutting toward the Channel. The maneuver trapped large Allied forces in the north and created the emergency evacuation from Dunkirk, where naval vessels and civilian craft helped bring hundreds of thousands of troops to Britain. Now, evacuation was a rescue, not a victory, because much heavy equipment was abandoned and France remained in grave danger. German forces pushed south, Paris fell, and France signed an armistice in June 1940. The speed of collapse shocked the world because France had one of Europe's largest armies, and memories of the previous war suggested years of trench fighting. Modern war had changed the relationship between movement, communications, air power, and decision-making, punishing slow clan systems with extraordinary speed. With France defeated, Britain stood as Germany's main active opponent in Western Europe, and an invasion across the English Channel became a serious possibility. Before any landing could succeed, Germany needed control of the skies, leading to the Battle of Britain in 1940. The Royal Air Force relied on fighter aircraft, radar stations, ground observers, repair crews, factories, and a command network that could direct squadrons toward incoming attacks. Here's what's fascinating. Radar did not win the battle alone, but it helped Britain use limited fighters more efficiently by providing early warning, reducing the need for constant patrols. German attacks shifted among airfields, industry, and cities, while British pilots and ground crews observed enormous pressure. The campaign showed that technology becomes powerful only when connected to organization, training, logistics, and clear information. Britain remained in the war, making a German invasion far more difficult and preserving a base for future Allied operations. The result also demonstrated a counterintuitive truth. Defending successfully can be strategically decisive even when it does not capture a single mile of enemy territory. The conflicts widened dramatically in 1941, turning a mostly European war into a truly global struggle. In June, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, opening an immense eastern front stretching across thousands of kilometers. German forces achieved huge early advances and captured enormous numbers of Soviet troops. But distance, resistance, supply problems, weather, and Soviet industrial capacity complicated the campaign. In December, Japan attacked the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, breaking the United States directly into the war. Actually, Japan's vigors helped a rapid series of victories would secure resources and create a defensive perimeter before American industrial power could fully mobilize. Germany then declared war on the United States, linking the European and Pacific conflicts even more tightly. The Axis powers now faced opponents with vast populations, territory, natural resources, and industrial capacity. But those advantages would take time to convert into battlefield power. By the end of 1941, the war had become a contest not only of armies, but also of shipping, oil, factories, scientific research, and national endurance. World War II was fought with tanks, aircraft, ships, and artillery, but underneath those machines was an economic competition of staggering scale. The United States converted civilian factories to military production, the Soviet Union moved major industries eastward beyond immediate German reach, Britain organized imports and rationing, and Germany tried to sustain a vast war effort across occupied Europe. Now, a tank that cannot receive fuel, spare parts, ammunition, trained crews, or rail transport is not really a useful tank for long. That is why logistics can matter as much as dramatic battlefield maneuvers. Standardized production allowed thousands of vehicles and aircraft to be repaired with interchangeable parts, while merchant shipping moved food, fuel, weapons, and troops across dangerous oceans. Governments also mobilized civilians through rationing, war bonds, new industrial jobs, and scientific programs. Women entered many forms of war production in huge numbers as labor shortages transformed workplaces. The societal impact reached dinner tables and family routines because total war blurred the boundary between battlefield and home front. Economic strength did not guarantee victory by itself, but the ability to replace losses repeatedly became one of the Allies' greatest strategic advantages. The war accelerated technologies that changed combat and later civilian life, including radar, sonar, rocketry, computing, medicine, and nuclear physics. Code breaking became especially important because encrypted messages could reveal enemy intentions, convoy routes, or operational patterns if analysts solved them quickly enough. British work at Bletchley Park, combined with intelligence from many sources, helped exploit German communications, while American cryptanalysis contributed to major Pacific successes. In fact, information had a shelf life. Knowing where an enemy force was yesterday might be useless unless commanders could act before the situation changed. Radar converted invisible radio reflections into warning of aircraft or ships, turning physics into practical battlefield awareness. Mass production of penicillin and improvements in blood transfusion, surgery, and evacuation helped more wounded service members survive than in earlier wars. Rocket development produced weapons such as Germany's V2, foreshadowing later muscle and space technology. The Manhattan Project pushed nuclear science into an unprecedented industrial program, creating atomic bombs used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Scientific breakthroughs increased military power, but they also created moral questions that did not disappear when the war ended. By 1942 and 1943, the axis in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway, damaged Japanese carrier strength and shifted the strategic initiative toward the United States. In North Africa, Allied forces defeated Axis armies after campaigns shaped heavily by ports, fuel, desert distance, and control of the Mediterranean. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad became a devastating turning point as a major German army was surrounded and forced to surrender. Wait. No single battle magically decided the entire war, but together these reversals exposed a growing problem for the Axis. Losses were becoming harder to replace while Allied production kept increasing. The Soviet Union launched larger offensives in the East. The Western Allies invaded Italy, and bombing campaigns targeted German industry and transportation. Germany still remained extremely dangerous, yet strategic momentum was shifting. The war had become a grinding mathematics of manpower, fuel, factories, shipping, aircraft, and time, and those numbers increasingly favored the Allied coalition. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history, opening the long-awaited Western Front against Nazi Germany. The operation required months of planning, deception, weather forecasting, naval coordination, airborne landings, engineering, and a continuous flow of supplies across the channel. Soldiers faced fortified coastal defenses and intense fighting as they tried to establish secure beachheads. Actually, the landing itself was only the first problem. The invasion could fail later if Allied armies could not bring ashore enough fuel, ammunition, vehicles, food, and reinforcements. Artificial harbors, landing craft, repaired ports, and eventually fuel pipelines helped sustain the expanding campaign. Allied forces break out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed toward Germany while Soviet armies advanced from the east. The result created the strategic nightmare German planners had feared for years: major enemies pressing from opposite directions. Yet victory still required months of difficult fighting, including the failed German counteroffensive in the Ardennes during the winter of 1944 and 1945. In 1945, Allied armies entered Germany from west and east as the Nazi state collapsed under military defeat. Berlin fell to Soviet forces, Hitler died in late April, and Germany surrendered in May, ending the war in Europe. The Pacific War continued as American forces moved closer to Japan through island campaigns that demonstrated how costly a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands might become. In August, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and attacked Japanese forces in Manchuria. Japan announced its surrender in August, and the formal surrender was signed in September 1945. Honestly, historians still debate how the atomic bombings, Soviet entry, blockade, conventional bombing, and Japanese political calculations interacted in the final decision. What is not disputed is that the war ended with extraordinary destruction across multiple continents. Victory stopped Axis expansion and dictatorship, but it did not erase the suffering created during 6 years of terror war. The end of fighting opened a new question. What kind of international system could prevent another catastrophe of similar scale? World War II killed tens of millions of people, with civilians making up an enormous share of the dead. Nazi Germany and its collaborators carried out the Holocaust, systematically murdering 6 million Jews and persecuting and killing millions of other victims through racial, political, and occupation policies. Across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, communities were destroyed by occupation, execution, starvation, forced labor, sieges, and mass displacement. In Asia, Japanese occupation and warfare caused immense civilian suffering across China and other territories. Anyway, reducing the war to maps and arrows can hide the central reality that every front represented families losing homes, relatives, health, and years of ordinary life. Bombing campaigns destroy open neighborhoods, while hunger and disease followed, disrupted agriculture and transportation. Millions of people ended the war as refugees, prisoners, orphan children, displaced workers, or survivors searching for relatives. The social consequences lasted for decades through trauma, demographic loss, ruining infrastructure, and political upheaval. Any simplified history has to remember that strategic decisions were ultimately experienced by individual human beings, not by colored blocks moving across a map. What if Britain had made peace in 1940? Germany had defeated the Soviet Union quickly, or Japan had destroyed more American carriers at Pearl Harbor. Counterfactuals can help explain which factors mattered, but they become misleading when they treat history like a single switch. Each alternative would create new reactions, logistical problems, political choices, and unpredictable consequences, rather than one guaranteed outcome. Actually, World War II demonstrates how systems interact. Ideology shapes decisions, economics limits ambition, geography constrains armies, and human judgment can amplify or correct mistakes. After 1945, the United Nations was created, European powers weakened, the United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, and the Cold War reorganized global politics. Decolonization accelerated as empires faced new pressures, while international institutions tried to manage trade, security, refugees, and reconstruction. Nuclear weapons created a future in which another great power war could threaten civilization itself. The lasting lesson is not that history repeats in identical patterns, but that aggressive expansion, dehumanizing ideology, fair deterrence, and unchecked power can combine dangerously. Understanding the war matters because its institutions, borders, technologies, alliances, memories, and warnings still influence the world we live in.